I do not claim to be an expert on the Constitution or American law, nor am I a historian. Rather, I am a professor of women's and gender studies who continues to teach and be a student in the field. My hope today is that we can have a conversation about the need to continue to discuss and work for women's rights. I'll try to provide some context and background for this conversation. In teaching about women's rights, I always begin my introduction to women's studies classes by teaching women's suffrage, particularly in the United States. Aside from being an inspiring story for students, for all of us really, I hope, it is also a good starting place for considering women's rights and the struggles to achieve them. I have never had a student who didn't support women's right to vote, at least not yet. And because of this common ground, the students are amazed that the change in law took so long, involved such commitment and determination, the writing, the organizing, the marching, the campaigning, the vigils, the imprisonments, the hunger strikes, the missteps, and prejudices, that it was so greatly opposed, entailed such violence against women, and just squeaked by into law. So there's hope for the ERA. They have barely been taught this history in their studies of our nation's past, and if they've been told anything at all, it seems to be through a story that is glossed over and presented in such a way that it communicates that women were given, rather than earned, the right to vote. Right. It seems that many have the uninformed notion that it just became time for women to have the vote. Or in other words, that there was an inherent desire to award women's rights on the part of those in power. This denies an understanding that the reason women need to have their rights addressed is that there has been a systematic effort to deny or limit those rights. The women's suffrage movement was necessary because beginning in 1777, 1 year after that great Independence Day we all celebrate so patriotically, states in the United States began passing laws to take away women's right to vote, making it clear that the people of the Constitution were not women, at least not when it came to the vote. By 1787, all states but New Jersey had revoked that right. New Jersey eventually followed in 1807. So I deliberately begin with suffrage in my classes, as we see that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and countless other women, some men, recognized that women's rights meant nothing without the elective franchise of women. And just an aside, still Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, written 10 years after women's suffrage was made law in England, questioned whether the vote or equal financial opportunity mattered more to women's parity. I think we have this question today. She leaned toward the money. She thought that might be more important to women. And even Alice Paul, that tireless and inspirational American suffragist leader, determined that the vote itself was not sufficient protection for women's rights, and in 1923 proposed the Equal Rights Amendment, stating, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." One point about the debate over the ERA, some argue that the ERA is not needed because the 14th Amendment protects women as citizens. However, a closer look at that amendment shows that citizens and voters are described there as specifically male. Okay. So when Elizabeth Cady Stanton presented her Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions at the 1848 Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, she used the wording of the Declaration of Independence, but added in women to make her points. Doing so effectively emphasized the exclusion of women from the original writing. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," she wrote, "that men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, and she was very smart to include this part, she said, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse alliance to it and to insist upon the institution of a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Frederick Douglass called the document the grand movement for attaining the civil, social, political, and religious rights of women. Many of the resolutions do not apply to today's circumstances or laws, such as, at the time, the inability of women to own property, including her own wages, obtain an education, force vote, retain custody of her children after having a divorce, have a voice in making laws, have recourse for having been punished, including physically, by her husband. However, some of the sentiments still resonate, concluding with this concern of Stanton's. Indeed, it is an accusation about patriarchy. That's what she said. He has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. It seems that this issue is one we still address when we consider women's rights. How do we make a world in which women really are, to paraphrase Douglass, civilly, socially, politically, economically, and religiously equal? Do laws themselves make this happen? If not, how do we truly change society to assure women's rights? How do we change attitudes and expectations? These questions continue to be important to our work for equality, parity in a world where women are still continuing to achieve first. I think it's always remarkable. We read something and it says the first woman to do such and such or to achieve such a position. As Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote in 1848, the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So today, you are celebrating 40 years. And when we look back to that historic period, we see a lot of advancement to be pleased about. At the same time, we might be surprised to realize that it was not that long ago, 40 years is really not that long ago in terms of history, that these rights still needed to be earned or won and granted. So here are some highlights from the 1970s, around 40 years ago. In 1971, Phillips v. Martin Marietta Corporation, the Supreme Court outlaws the practice of private employers refusing to hire women with preschool children. Reed v. Reed, also 1971. The U.S. Supreme Court holds unconstitutional a state law from Idaho establishing automatic preference for male as administrators of wills. This is the first time the court strikes down a law treating men and women differently. The court finally declares women as persons, but uses a reasonableness test, that's remarkable, rather than making sex a suspect classification, analogous to race under the 14th Amendment. 1972, Title IX of the Education Amendments prohibits sex discriminations in all aspects of education programs that receive federal support, and we know that in the 1990s, this is then updated in examining equality in sports in education. Also 72, Eisenstadt v. Bard, the Supreme Court rules that the right to privacy encompasses an unmarried person's right to use contraceptives. 1973, Pittsburgh Press v. Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. The Supreme Court bans sex-segregated help-wanted advertising as a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as amended. I think some people may not realize that before that ad said men and women wanted. Of course, in 1973, Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton, the Supreme Court declares that the Constitution protects women's right to terminate an early pregnancy. thus making abortion legal in the U.S. 1974, housing discrimination on the basis of sex and credit discrimination against women is outlawed by Congress. Some of you may remember that women could not get a credit card in their own name. Cleveland Board of Education v. LaFleur determines it is illegal to force pregnant women to take maternity leave on the assumption that they are incapable of working in their physical condition. And we know, of course, that in education, there were rules. I think 4th month of pregnancy, women had to leave their jobs of teaching. The Women's Education Equality Act, drafted by Arlene Horowitz and introduced by Representative Patsy Mink, funds the development of non-sexist teaching materials and model programs that encourage full educational opportunities for girls and women. The Equal Opportunity Commission, the Justice and Labor Departments, and AT&T signed a consent decree banning AT&T's discriminatory practices against women and minorities. In 1975, Taylor v. Louisiana denies states the right to exclude women from juries, 1975. 1976, General Electric Company v. Gilbert, the Supreme Court upholds women's right to unemployment benefits during the last 3 months of pregnancy. Also in 76, this one is remarkable. Craig v. Warren, the Supreme Court declares unconstitutional a state law permitting 18 to 20-year-old females to drink beer while denying the rights to men of the same age. The court establishes a new set of standards for reviewing laws that treat men and women differently, and it's called an intermediate test, which is stricter than the reasonableness test for constitutionality in sex discrimination cases. And in 1978, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act bans employment discrimination against pregnant women. So some of these may seem just silly and impossible to have ever been in need of addressing, such as women not serving on juries or not having access to credit. And again, that law making it legal for young women to drink beer and not young men is just baffling and maybe a bit disturbing. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. But others from this time are still in need of enforcing, particularly laws related to work and pregnancy, where discrimination can be disguised as other workplace actions, and attitudes continue to devalue the abilities of pregnant workers. And we recognize, of course, that currently Roe v. Wade is in constant danger of being overturned, or at least challenged, as states push through laws limiting the right to legal abortion. I wanted to address women's rights today because I think we are at risk of becoming complacent or overly confident about them. That, as a student once told me when we were discussing threats to legal abortion, we might think, even unconsciously, well, we got that right before, we'll just do it again. That's exactly what she said to me. If that happens, we'll just get it back again. And we tend to think of women's rights issues as the troubles of women in other countries, other places in the world where we see women and girls being controlled and prevented from having the same rights as men. Of course, that is concerning, and we should be aware of those injustices and help if we can and where we can. However, we should also be paying close attention to our own rights, to the ways in which they are being limited or denied because we are women. I'm going to list some that concern me. I put through a few in here, and I hope we can discuss ideas for addressing them as well as those issues and challenges to rights that may concern you. Violence against women is one that I wanted to point out. Despite the Violence Against Women Act, and we saw how debated its authorization was last year, hotly debated, its reauthorization. The Violence Against Women Act, which offers punishments for acts of violence and support and services related to domestic violence and stalking. Despite that, statistics remain high for violence against women. Women were about 6 times more likely than men to experience violence committed by an intimate. Somewhere in America, a woman is battered, usually by her intimate partner, every 15 seconds. Women annually reported about 500,000 rapes and sexual assaults. Friends or acquaintances of the victims committed over half of these rapes or sexual assaults. Over 22 million women in the United States have been raped in their lifetime. About 1/3 of female murder victims aged 12 or older are killed by an intimate partner. The costs of intimate partner violence against women exceed an estimated $5.8 billion. These costs include nearly $4.1 billion in the direct cost of medical care and mental health care, and nearly $1.8 billion in the indirect costs of lost productivity and present value of lifetime earnings. The UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women states that violence against women is a manifestation of historically unequal power relations between men and women, and that violence against women is one of the crucial social mechanisms by which women are forced into a subordinate position compared with men. Another issue I think is important is pay equity. Despite laws to the contrary, such as the Equal Pay Act of 1963, women still earn less than men for comparable work. The pay gap hasn't budged in a decade. This statistic says in 2012 as in 2002, but I checked out and in 2014 we have the same statistic. Among full-time year-round workers, women were paid 77% of what men were paid. Women in every state experience the pay gap, but some states are worse than others. The best place in the United States for pay equity, Washington, D.C., where women were paid 90% of what men were paid in 2012. At the other end of the spectrum is Wyoming, the worst state in the country for pay equity, where women were paid just 64% of what women were paid. The pay gap is worse for women of color. Hispanic women's salaries show the largest gap at 53% of white men's earnings. Women face a pay gap in nearly every occupation. The pay gap grows with age, though earnings are almost comparable in life at earlier in life at 90%. After 35, median earnings for women are typically 75 to 80% of what men are paid. While more education is an effective tool for increasing earnings, it is not an effective tool against the gender pay gap, as it exists at all levels of employment. Contrary to popular thought, the pay gap also exists among women without children, as I think some people think, well, this has to do with women who are having a family and have children to care for. Women's health insurance is another important right that we need to look at. Women still pay more than men for the same health insurance coverage. The new health care law will prohibit such gender ratings starting this year, but gaps persist in most states with no evidence that insurers have taken steps to reduce them. A 30-year-old woman will pay 31% more, could pay 31% more than what a man of the same age pays for the same coverage. The National Women's Law Center says that in states that have not banned gender rating, more than 90% of the best-selling health plans charge women more than men. Insurers said they charged women more because claims show that women aged 19 to 55 tended to use more health care services. Federal law prohibits sex discrimination under any health program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. Yet, for instance, non-smoking women often pay more than male smokers of the same age for the same coverage. Another area I think we need to look at is political representation by women. In 2013, the United States ranked 77th in worldwide female leadership. This is a statistic from the Worldwide Guide to Women in Leadership. When the 113th United States Congress convened in January 2013, there were 98 female members of Congress overall. Out of 535 members, that's only 18.3% of Congress. 20 female senators, or 20%. 78 female representatives, or 17.9%. Even as small as these percentages are, the 113th Congress has a record number of females in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. A record number, as we look at the percentages, may be concerned. As a result of the 2012 elections, there are 5 female women governors. Among the 100 largest cities in the United States, 12 have female mayors.